Hi, this is Pastor Barry with a bonus video in our series on the themes of the upper story. In this video, I want to review what we mean when we talk about the upper story and the lower story, and a little bit about how they're related to one another. In talking to people, I find that people are using this language of the lower story and the upper story. They're just having trouble nailing down what specifically they mean by that. And so I'm hoping that I can clarify in a brief video. When we talk about the lower story, we're talking about the specifics of a particular story. That means we're looking at a Bible person or persons, the circumstances and challenges that they face, how they respond to God and others in the midst of those circumstances, what the outcome is, and what we can learn from that. Um, we have a version ourselves of a lower story because we have our own circumstances and challenges. We have our own ways that we respond to God and others in the midst of our challenges, our own outcomes, and uh, lessons that could be learned from that. So the lower story is about specifics. Just as an example, if you look at Abram and Sarai from chapter 2, the lower story on them is that their big crisis is that they have no son. In fact, they've never had a baby. And this is in a culture where that was super important, so much so that not having a child was almost like being cursed. And so it's a big deal that they don't have a child. And God comes to them and promises them uh, a son as well as many, many descendants. He also talks about how they'll live in a particular land and all these kinds of things. But the rest of Abram and Sarai's lower story is the story of the different challenges they face and how they faced them. Facing famine, facing threat from Sarai being such a good looking woman and maybe they'll kill Abram over it. Um, Being challenged by God to offer the son of the promise on an altar, etc. Those things are the lower story. And when we look at them, we can find lessons that we can apply in our own lives about faith, about what it looks like to trust God. It's more than just a belief that you have in your head, it's a lived out belief. It's taking God's promises as true and living that way. Um, that would be the lower story stuff. The upper story is the big picture of what God is doing. Frazee describes it as what God is up to, how he's weaving our stories into his one divine love story. On our staff team, we've talked about the upper story as kind of God's bigger story of redemption. In brief, uh, you could use these four terms: creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. By creation, we talk about the world as God intended it, the world that God made, a world with perfect relationships between God and people, between people and each other, and even between people and their environment. Uh, it was also a world which had this promise attached to it that God's glory and his rule would extend to the whole earth through the ones that were part of God's family and made in his image. This was the commission that was given to the first man and the first woman to fill the earth and to subdue it. Um, that is supposed to be a statement of God's kingdom going forth into the whole earth through his people. When we talk about fall, we're describing how that world, that first world, was lost, how sin entered the world, and with sin, brokenness, sickness, evil, and death. It's the story of how all of our relationships were broken. the relationship between us and God, relationships between each of us and one another. So that's true on a interpersonal level, like between husband and wife or parents and children. It's also true on a global level, between nations or between ethnic groups. There's all this strife and injustice in the world, violence, and it all comes from this fall, from the sin that entered the world and corrupted all of our relationships. So that was creation, fall, and then redemption. Redemption is a description of how God reclaims us and the whole earth. And we're going to get into that a little bit further as the story goes on. Obviously, the coming of Jesus and the cross and the resurrection are a huge central piece in God's plan of redemption, of reclaiming, of rescuing the world. And then consummation is the fourth act in the story. It is a description of a future world in which it's the world God intends again, a world in which all the relationships are made right between God and people, between people and each other, between people and their environment, and in which the reign of God extends over the whole earth through the ones who are part of God's family and made in his image. In this case, it is the redeemed humanity that God sort of executes his reign throughout the earth. So creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. In the story of Abram and Sarai, we see that there is more at work than just one childless elderly couple and their problems. There's a bigger story behind their little story. I'm not saying their little story is not important. It was important. But there's this bigger story of God's plan of redemption that works in part by calling out a people for himself. If you think about it, God didn't have to use that method to redeem the world. I mean, he could have just sent Jesus instantly. He did not. So what is all this business about calling a people for himself? Why is that important, and what are they for? Part of what we find that they're for is they are to be a kind of object lesson to the world of what it means to be in right relationship with God, how you worship, how you relate to one another. If you have a right relationship with God, it changes your relationships with people. You don't exploit them anymore. You love them. You care for the weak. All those kinds of things. And so the people of God were supposed to be this kind of preview of the world that God desired, and they were supposed to be messengers of that world, of that world to everyone on earth. They did not always live up to that, and we'll talk about that more later. But that was the purpose of God's calling a people, and that has implications for us today. Well, kind of to round out this short explanation of the lower and upper story, Frazee says this: every story in the Bible contains practical wisdom for us who are dwelling in the lower story. We should look for and use these discoveries in our daily lives. In other words, all of us face particular challenges, particular circumstances. We're living in our own lower story, and from the lower stories of people in the Bible, we can learn lessons that will help us to live more faithfully, and we should do that. But he says at the same time, God is using every story in the Bible to tell his one upper story of how we get back into the garden with him forever. I think that's Frazee's way of describing how we end up back in this restored relationship with God. I wouldn't have used this getting back into the garden because actually, I believe that God isn't trying to get us back into the garden. He is sending us out into the whole earth so that the whole world can be the world that he intended from the beginning. Anyway, Frazee closes this quote by saying, when you read the Bible, look for both storylines. So I hope that as you read the Bible, as you read the story individually, and when you read the Bible individually, and when you read the story in your discipleship groups, that you will be reading both for the specifics of a particular Bible character's situation, but also for the story behind the story of how their smaller story fits into this bigger plan of redemption that God has for the whole earth. God bless you as you continue to delve into his word using this tool, the story. Help each other to continue to grow in God's word.